Recently, all across the world we've seen much debate around statues, with many being called to be taken down due to their links with the past horrors of slavery and discrimination. However, today, we're going to tell you the story of possibly the world's most humbling statue. Sitting overlooking the North Bay in Scarborough, a lovely seaside town in Yorkshire, England, sits the statue of Freddie Gilroy and the Belsen Stragglers. It sits ominously overlooking the sea, and most people walk past it without knowing the Second World War story behind the large man sitting on the seafront. For this statue celebrates the ordinary man who in history can do great things and save lives, but also see the horrors of evil. Like millions of men during the Second World War, Freddie Gilroy was drawn into the worldwide conflict, where he would see different parts of the world, make new friends and ultimately see many of these die. This normal man fought the evil enemy of Nazism, and in his years of service, he would see many sights that he wished he would have forgotten. The man Freddie Gilroy was a rather quiet, kind and loving man, and his experiences would shape the creation of this statue. This statue doesn't honour someone famous, it simply celebrates the ordinary man, and how ordinary men and women can fight evil, and they can in fact change the world. So join us today as we look at one man's personal story of liberating Bergen-Belsen, the same concentration camp that Anne Frank would die in. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Now, Fred Gilroy was born in South Hetton in County Durham on the 13th of May 1921, the son of a miner at a local colliery. Life was hard for the Gilroys and Fred was one of 6 children. Their family would be very poor like many mining families, and Fred would always be wearing the hand-me-downs of his siblings, and even often went to school without shoes, his family being too poor to replace them. After school he followed in his father's footsteps, working in the colliery, but would become a bricklayer there, building walls to prevent water from flooding the mines. He would also be responsible with maintaining the mine shafts, and also looking after the buildings above ground. He later went on to join the Territorial Army, and when the Second World War came around, Fred's life would change forever. He was immediately called into active service and would leave his life in England behind him to fight a new enemy, the Nazis. For the majority of his time in the Second World War, he would become a gun aimer with the Royal Artillery, and towards the end of the conflict, he would become a regimental police officer. During the fighting he and his battalion would see, which would result in severe casualties, with Fred seeing many of his closest friends dying, which would impact Freddie for the rest of his life. But nothing would prepare him for what he would see in April 1945. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was an infamous Nazi prisoner of war camp that initially was an exchange camp, where Jewish hostages were held in return for exchanging them for German prisoners of war. Later the camp would expand to accommodate Jews and other people classed as undesirable, and would then become a concentration camp, altering after being handed over to the SS. Conditions inside the Belsen complex were horrendous. By late 1944 food rations began to deteriorate, and by early 1945 prisoners would sometimes go without food for days, and the supply of fresh water was also extremely limited. Sanitation was incredibly poor, with very few toilets for the tens of thousands of prisoners who were interred there. The camp was incredibly overcrowded, and coupled with poor sanitation and a lack of supplies, this led to devastating outbreaks of disease such as dysentery, typhoid, typhus, and tuberculosis. In the early months of 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners would die. In 1945, with there seemingly looking like an end to the Second World War in Europe, leading to the fall of the Third Reich, Allied and Soviet soldiers would stumble across numerous Nazi concentration camps that had been abandoned. With each one of these that was discovered, the liberators would be greeted with horrendous sights of dead bodies, starving people and complete horror. When the British and Canadian forces advanced on Bergen-Belsen, the German army negotiated a truce and an exclusion zone around the camp to prevent the spread of typhus. On April the 11th, 1945, Heinrich Himmler agreed to have the camp handed over without a fight, and some of the SS guards would begin to order the prisoners to bury the dead. The next day, representatives of the Wehrmacht were approached by the British, and the agreement was signed designating 48 square kilometres around the camp as a neutral zone. Most of the SS soldiers who would be responsible for the horror inside the camp would be allowed to leave. The British intended on reaching Bergen-Belsen on April the 14th, but due to heavy local fighting, this was delayed until the 15th of April 1945. When the British and Canadian soldiers entered the camp, they found over 13,000 unburied bodies and around 60,000 inmates, most of whom were rather sick and starving. The prisoners had been left without food or water for days, and in the days before the liberation it was estimated that 500 people a day were dying at the camp, mostly from typhus. One of the liberators was Fred Gilroy. When he arrived, he was met with the stench of rotting bodies, which had been smelt from 3 miles away, and the scene was horrifying. Quickly though, action was needed to try and save the lives of those within the camp still, and there would be a huge clean-up needed of the area. The British would force the former SS camp personnel there to bury the dead in mass graves, with the Commandant Joseph Kramer being arrested. The British would start to provide emergency medical care, clothing and food to those inmates in dire need. Over the next few days, the surviving prisoners were deloused and moved to a nearby German Panzer Army camp, which became known as Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. Over a period of 4 weeks, almost 29,000 survivors would be moved there. The massive effort to help the survivors with food and medical treatment would result in saving many thousands of lives, but for 9,000 of the prisoners in April they were too late, and another 4,000 prisoners would die in June, months after the liberation. The camp would be burned down by flame-thrown Bren gun carriers and Churchill crocodile tanks to exterminate the typhus epidemic and the louse infestation. 1 month after the liberation, Freddie Gilroy would turn 24 within the camp. It was a day he would remember and grieve for the rest of his life. In a later interview he said that on his birthday every year, he would cry remembering the conditions of Bergen-Belsen and the aftermath of the Nazi evil he had witnessed with his own eyes. For Fred Gilroy would be one of these soldiers who would help the survivors of the camp, and also deal with the cleanup and the aftermath. Following the war, Fred Gilroy was asked to join the Palestinian police force, but he declined because of the poverty at home, and he needed to get back to support and see his family in his role as a miner. The sights of Bergen-Belsen must have influenced his decision to return to England. He would never marry, but when his brother died at the age of 47, he stepped in to help his sister-in-law raise his nephew. Despite his role in fighting in the war, he would become the final member of his large family to die, living until succumbing to cancer in December 2008. The reason Fred's story is immortalised in statue form is because he was an ordinary man, a kind, generous and well-meaning gentleman who was drawn into a worldwide conflict, and the sights he would see during the war would haunt his memory for the rest of his life. He was a loving family man who helped to right the wrongs of the evil by helping those prisoners at Bergen-Belsen. His statue that was made by a sculptor friend helps to encapsulate the idea that everyday people can do extraordinary things and contribute greatly to the goodness of the world. Today it sits overlooking the North Sea in a rather contemplating way, and reminds us that people you pass in the street may have done remarkable good in the world, even if they don't brag about their story. The story of Freddie Gilroy and the Belsen Stragglers is certainly a story worth commemorating in statue form, and is a story definitely worth remembering. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Once again, thank you for watching.